O futuro dos transportes discute-se aqui. Prepare-se para acelerar a mudança. Electric Summit 2025. Seja parte desta revolução.
Thank you for the very kind introduction and for the invitation, Diana. Thank you for the invitation. Minister, thank you for the plug for my book. Very much appreciated. And I would like to talk today about Europe, not only about Germany. Germany is an important part of that story, but I wanted to start with a sort of a mixture of an American marketing story and a European fairy tale. In medieval Denmark, two tailors wanted to sell their clothes to the king. And they both make their presentations, and in the evening they go home to their families or to their wives, and the first tailor said, "The emperor wears no clothes, there is no market." And the second tailor goes home and says, "The emperor wears no clothes, there's a huge market." And I think that's a bit the way to look at Europe at the moment. We have to sort of recognize that the emperor, the EU, isn't wearing any clothes. It's very weak, and is probably going to get a lot weaker. And as individuals, it's our choice to think about this as as either a defeatist thing where we basically accept this to happen and completely delude ourselves, or whether actually we see this as an opportunity for change. Sort of as a preamble, let me just say what I think is going to happen. So I think we're in a story where things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. And whether they're going to get better or not depends to a very large extent on us, not only on the rest of the world. I don't know whether you saw the news overnight, but it appears, in fact, there's been quite a lot of corroboration that the Americans have agreed a peace deal with Russia on Ukraine. And these negotiations are in a fairly advanced state. The Financial Times, the paper I used to work for, has reported this. I can pretty much confirm this is very solid reported. Axios has also reported on the story a somewhat separate information. The information adds up. It gave us a very complete picture of what is happening. And the story that is happening is that the Europeans are not involved in this. The German foreign minister said this morning he was not even briefed by this. So he read about it in the newspapers, basically. And I wouldn't be surprised if the British foreign minister or the French foreign minister were also not being involved. This is the Americans, a delegation of senior advisors to Trump, including the vice president and the secretary of state, and negotiating with Russia, with aids to Putin. So this is basically a diplomatic, sort of a high-level diplomatic initiative. When Russia approved Donald Trump's the statement that welcoming Donald Trump's peace agreement in Gaza in the UN Security Council, Russia accepted this. And this was basically also part of this entire deal of sort of a Russian-American détente. This is quite a big moment for Europe. Now I see the first reaction in Europe, they're dismissing this is a bad deal, we should say no to this. But we're not going to say no to this. And the reason we're not going to say no to this is because we haven't got the weapons to support this war ourselves. And more importantly, we haven't got the money. The French government has budgeted only 120 million euros, that's a million with an M, for Ukraine support. The previous German government completely ended all budget allocations for Ukraine because they thought we can fund this from the Russian assets that sit in Brussels. This is essentially the plan. The EU has not committed any money. The idea is to fund this through the Russian assets that sit in Brussels. And for those, I used to come to Lisbon a lot to talk about the financial crisis. This was like 10 years ago, the Euro financial crisis. And before we had the Euro financial crisis, we had the global financial crisis, and that was, the subprime bonds. This thing that they have set up is very much like a subprime bond. They didn't want to sequester the Russian money because this would have been dangerous. So what they've done instead is set up a legal construction, an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, that is located in the EU, with no offices abroad, so no foreign court can access this purpose vehicle. This purpose vehicle raises debt through the member states on behalf of the EU. The debt will then be loaned out to Ukraine, and Ukraine is supposed to pay it back. Of course, we all know that Ukraine will not pay this back. Nobody believes it will be paying back. And the hope is that future reparations payment by Russia will cover for this loss. And if Russia refuses to pay, then the money in the funds will then be used to compensate the Europeans. I can say with absolute certainty that this will not happen. If there is a peace agreement, Russia will insist on having this money unfrozen because it's their money. So what will happen is that this loan scheme that the Europeans have set, this is the emperor with no clothes. This is a big claim that we have a scheme, we have money available for Ukraine, but we're not willing to make it available ourselves. We're not willing to pay the price. We're not willing to cut social spending or anything that we're actually spending money on in favor of it. We're not willing to make sacrifices for this. We're only willing to spend other people's money or load up with debt. This is not a military strategy. You can't win wars by through making no sacrifices. And this has been I think the dishonesty of the European position. I'm not even talking about whether it is right or wrong to support Ukraine. I think it is right. But I think it is also important that these things are properly funded and that they have a proper strategy, like an end game, like an idea of where we want to be. This is not about right or wrong. This is about, war is a very serious business. And I got the impression, or I have been sort of getting the impression that the war that we have been funding has no strategic objective or no agreed strategic objective. Victory for Ukraine is pretty much out of the question. The military victory is not possible, in my view. We've seen Russia now occupying increasing sections of the Donbas in eastern Ukraine. It just occupied the important strategic city of Prokrovsk, which was one of the sort of critical towns where a lot of Ukrainian supply lines passed through. And the deal that was agreed yesterday between the Russians and the Americans is one that will secure Russia the entirety of the Donbas. So this is essentially what Russia asked for. So if you look at the details of this deal, this is close to the original demands of Russia. So we are basically looking for a very humiliating defeat by Ukraine. And what doesn't help at the moment is the corruption scandal in Ukraine. Zelensky is weakened by this. There's going to be more coming out in the investigations. We're hearing the first people calling for his resignation, including in the West. We have not seen this faltering support. So things are going really badly for Ukraine at the moment. So they're in a weak position. The Europeans are in a weak position, and that means that I would assume that this plan will actually be happening because there isn't another plan on the table. And there isn't another strategy on the table. It's not like the Europeans, it's not like Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron have a strategy. They have procedures, they have principles, but they don't have a strategy that could lead to a better outcome for Ukraine. Victory, I think, is off the table, but a better outcome could have been achievable had this been done with more coordination. And I believe without the United States, this would have been very difficult anyway, but if it could have been possible had the Europeans acted more decisively. Now, I don't want to talk about Ukraine all this day because we have a lot of entrepreneurs and CEOs in this audience, and you want to know about business. I was talking about it because it shows something about the modern EU. The fact that it has become, the EU that of my young years was the EU of hope, of the single market, the euro. It was the EU of a vibrant economy. Back in 1999, when the euro was founded, the EU was the region in the world most likely to succeed. Everyone was talking about the decline of America in the 21st century and the rise. Regulation will remain in place. It's still a regulation that based on protection. It's not about the data business that wants to be encouraged. It is it's the protection of individuals. This is at the heart of this regulation. This is also how law courts interpret it. The European Court of Justice sees this when there was a recent case where the court made the principle or established the principle that the purpose of this regulation is not to encourage business, but the purpose of this regulation is to protect consumers against business. And that's sort of the philosophy of this entire approach. And the idea that Europe is whereas others are the innovators and the business people, we are the regulators. That's something, a view that's very, very common in Brussels. I think everyone in, here would probably think this is crazy. How can you regulate an industry that you have no representation in, like AI? This is totally delusional. But in Brussels, this has been until very recently been a very common idea that Europe is good at regulation, because regulation is what Brussels does for a living. So they haven't, they never questioned their ability to actually have, to have an effect. And the last thing in Europe, when if you look at global 20th century innovation, what were the big things that happened? Of course, the Internet 3.0, big data leading all the way to AI. Next stages would be quantum computing, environmental technologies. Most of these developments are happening, genetic research in the pharmaceuticals. Most of these developments are not happening in the EU. We have to be very, very upfront about this. We're not the innovators in the world anymore. We used to be the innovators, and these innovations that we created, we lived from these innovations for a very, very long time. And the thing with innovation is that something you innovated in the 19th century, like somebody inventing the car in the 19th century, created an industry that generated profits for over 100 years. And the same is with digital. The digital technologies were developed in the 1940s after the Manhattan Project. 1940s was the invention of the transistor. 10 years later, the integrated circuit. So the whole digital economy, the digital technology supply chain was developed in the United States in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. These were the moment where the sort of the main engineering developments took place. The main sort of scientific discovery was before. This was quantum mechanics. But the engineering happened around the 40s to the 60s. Now, America lives off this. This is basically the foundation of the modern American digital industry. And we also realize what role the state played in those years. It was the US Army, the US military that invested heavily in those technologies. Nowadays, it's not the case anymore. Nowadays, it's very much a private sector-driven a project with large companies like NVIDIA and OpenAI and obviously Google and all the other big tech companies. But we are not in there. And one of the reasons we are in there are many reasons why they're in there. The legislation, the data protection hasn't helped us. What's also not helping us is the lack of a genuine single market for investments, a capital markets union. In virtually all my when people ask me what's wrong with Europe, what's the one thing we can do, and I say make a capital markets union, because that, there's no way that Portugal or Germany even could fund a Google out of national savings. It's impossible. I cannot criticize the government here for failing to do that. It's just a scale effect. So we have to look at European savings. Europe is an advanced market with 500 million people, potentially larger than the United States. If we had a mechanism that would channel the savings of our citizens to the most profitable investments, that would be a mechanism that would bypass the banking system. So this is not something that we could do with established structures. It would be different actors that would be the middleman in that market, but it would have a huge impact. Now we all have. And we're doing rather well these days in startup companies. Every country has its own startup scene. And that was something that wasn't the case 10 years ago, and that's a good start, but we cannot generate startups and make them big. And that's where you need the capital markets from. Startup companies alone, venture capital is actually the easy part. It's the next step that's the hard part, and no European country has succeeded on this scale. So this is why I'm saying that the future of Europe is uncertain, in the sense that it's still things we can do, and things are going to get worse. I have no doubt that they will get a lot worse, but there are things we can do, like a capital markets union, a fiscal union. These are steps, a genuinely different attitude towards investment. Especially, a change of attitude, especially on the left of the political spectrum, which is increasingly become less interested. And I have observed this in Germany, where the left used to be the force for public sector investment. And, people always had these arguments about public sector versus private sector. But at least they were both interested in investment. The modern center-left in Germany is no longer interested in investment. They talk about it, but they are interested in transfers. They're interested in welfare. And I see this in the UK as well. They are not doing the investments, but they are really protecting welfare systems. And that's a tragedy for Europe, because with those welfare systems, without any flexibility on this, the energy we need in terms of innovating our economies, of all this sort of this Schumpeterian creative destruction, which is really what we need, cannot happen. So this is something where Europe sort of has to kind of wake up, and this is what's needed. But it is not just about the classic policies of the left and right. We're talking about innovation, and and certainly in Germany, the country. I write about this in my book, because it was the left and the right that both supported the policies not to innovate. The right is just as much responsible for this as the left. So this is basically a political argument that isn't going from the left to the right, but it's going orthogonal to this. And you get there's hardly anybody in the present political spectrum that would say, come on, let's do a capital markets union. Okay, let's innovate. This is not the language of politics. The difference is that in Germany in particular, that the right, the liberals on the liberals sort of on the center right, they want to protect different kind of companies, but it's still protectionism. It's still and even if you ask a German liberal, would you agree that an Italian bank buys Commerzbank? They would say no, of course not. So the idea of I have yet to meet a German liberal, basically. I haven't really, and they don't exist, or they may exist, but they may not speak. So at least not in public. So and that's sort of the challenge that we are facing. I'm saying this sort of in a hopeful way, because as our my little story about the tailors says, there's never sort of, the future cannot be predicted. We always think about analysts that I don't know the future. The brutal truth is that, you invite me to give a 30-minute speech about the future, I don't know more than you do, because there's so many possibilities. But there are certain strands that are foreseeable. So whether Europe succeeds or not is impossible to predict. This depends very much on us, on Europeans themselves. There are a number of things that we can pretty much foresee in the more short term. And in the more short term, there are going to be some pretty tough things happening. The loss of Ukraine is going to be a huge shock. It will come as a huge shock, especially to young Europeans and to those Europeans who have only ever sort of experienced victory in war. I live in the UK, where the experience has always been one of glorious victory, and the good guy would always win against the bad guy. That was sort of a long history of war narrative building, and sort of virtually all the Russia-Ukraine war was always sort of told in the narrative of the Second World War. And there was the church, there was a Churchill character, there was a Chamberlain character, there's obviously a Hitler character. Not hard to guess who that is. And it's this is not very helpful, because the soothing story is that the good guys win in the end. And they have no experience with an idea that the bad guy might win, or the bad guy might end up getting a good deal, which I think is the likely outcome. So this will come as a huge shock. It will also be a financial shock to European countries. It will make it perhaps very difficult for the EU to integrate Ukraine, because the EU has not agreed on how to finance this. This is the biggest financial project the EU will have ever undertaken, the integration of Ukraine, and this is not an agreed financial project. The second thing that I think is now very likely is that the far right will win in France in the 2027 presidential elections. Now, it's 18 months to go. Again, things will happen in the next 18 months. But I have rarely seen a candidate like Jordan Bardella, the most likely candidate for the far right, depending on whether Marine Le Pen gets her ban from running for office lifted. She may not. It's hard to say what the French appeals court will say. But he's leading in the polls 35 to 37%. The next person, Edouard Philippe, who used to be the front runner, is down at 15 to 19%. These ranges depend always on who runs against whom, who's in the race, who's not in the race. But these are sort of indicative ranges. And then there's a whole group of centrist candidates, who are all center-left, center-right candidates, who are all around 10 to 15%. In this scenario, it could be Bardella versus anybody. It could be sort of some unknown candidate who might just squeeze ahead of the others, but who may not have the institutional backing to win an election. And I would also not expect, as what happened in last year's parliamentary election, for the entire political spectrum to unite against the far right. That's what happened last year. That's what happened in all elections in France. Whenever, the first time when her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, got into the second round in the early 2000s, this was the election in 2002, I think. In that election, he ran, he managed to squeeze out the socialist candidate, Lionel Jospin, and the entire political spectrum, the left, the right, they all united against him. So he didn't get many votes. And that happened to his daughter as well, to Marine Le Pen in 2017 and 2022. I'm not sure it will happen again in 2027, because the chaos that we have in France is people are so disgusted by this that there will be, the idea, the worst thing for them is not a government of the far right. The worst thing is for the chaos to continue. And I think if electorates are at that moment, then that's when things will change. And when the far right wins off power, now it might be, I don't think it will be Meloni, another sort of, soft right conversion. Everybody was afraid of Meloni, but she was ultimately not a leader of the far right. She is a conservative. I would certainly classify her as a conservative. She's certainly a Democrat. She's certainly law-abiding. She's not breaking any laws or any constitutional rules or any EU rules for that matter. But Ella's already very different. I mean, all the policies, he's not advocating EU departure, but he is advocating policies that are not consistent with French EU membership. He wants the ECB to bail out French debt. He's saying we'll have to have a conversation, basically saying we're too big to fail. It's not a conversation Portugal was able to do when Portugal had a financial crisis. But France could say that. We're saying, look, I mean, we're not going to follow your advice. We're going to do what we want. We're going to tell you what you've got to do. And, and if not, then, you've got to remember we're too big to fail. And if we fail, we'll destroy you before we'll destroy ourselves. So it's pretty much the threat. The possibility of a financial crisis is there. It could involve France. It could bring down a lot of the Eurozone. I think this is a very likely scenario. If the ECB says yes to a bailout, it will be very inflationary. If the ECB says no to a bailout, it will be a problem for the French. It's bad for bonds everywhere, it's just the distribution is bad. So either the French bond yields go high and everyone else's stay low, or everyone's go high. So there are spillovers to this. This is not a free lunch. So this is something I could expect to happen. In Germany too, I would expect within 1 or 2 parliamentary elections to have a situation where it is not possible to form a government without the Alternative for Germany, which is the German far-right party. That too is a party that wants to leave the EU. It doesn't mean they will leave the EU, but what I think these far-right parties will do, I don't think the EU will break up or the euro will break up. I think the more likely scenario is that the EU will be crippled for a period while these parties are in power. And so I think stasis, stagnation, lack of progress, that is a much more likely scenario for the EU for a period as we're going through this phase. And then it will depend. I mean, I don't think that any of these parties, has any recipes. If I look at the German AfD, they don't even have an economic policy. They're actually wondering whether they should get one. It's quite almost comical to think. Or Nigel Farage in the UK, who is a character who is amazing that he's got 30 or 40% of the popular support in the polls. The man doesn't have an economic policy. He may have positions on certain things, like he has a position on pensions, but there is no economic strategy behind him. The same goes for any of the far-right parties. There isn't an economic strategy, which is interestingly different from the far-right parties of the 30s. They were quite different beasts. They were obviously much more militaristic and in nature. But the Nazis, at least, they had an economic policy, which is something that, for example, modern far-right parties don't have. And so what I would expect to happen is that they will get to power, mess things up, and then we will be in another, pick up the rubble from that period. So I don't think the political centrism will disappear. It will come back, but then it's the question of where are we going to be based? And so this is sort of my question. Are we going to start innovating? Are we going to change the European social model, which this is really about? We cannot maintain the European social model, not invest, and expect America to protect us, expect the world to be favorable to us. China is turning into a very aggressive competitor. So this will require quite a lot of courageous decisions that we have to make in Europe. And at the moment, we are not preparing for this. I can certainly say the European institutions are failing. That doesn't mean they will always fail. We could be two inspired leaders away from this. There will be a new leader eventually in France. I think Friedrich Merz is probably also not the greatest German leader that we've ever had. I think people had a lot of hopes in him, but he has disappointed a lot of people, both in terms of his reforms and in terms of also his diplomatic language. You probably heard what he said about Brazil. This was almost too, and the fact that he said it in a public comment. I mean, there's a speech. You can actually, you can listen to this. It shows you that he may not be he may not have adequately prepared for this job. So my sense is that we are going through a period at least of 2 or 3 years of heightened uncertainty, and I think we'll all have to watch out. So I think my half hour is over, so I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Mr. Nchau, thank you so much for your keynote. You address the geopolitical aspects in Europe, worldwide, the problems with innovation, and as you told on your book, I would like to know, is it the manufacturer's European car industry kaput? Can we de-risk from China?
I would think so, yes. I've been following the car industry for a long time. And I followed this. They went through stages of denial. First, the denial that electric cars would happen. Then, when they realized they would happen, they were very confident that they could. That once they did it, they would just capture the market. They failed to. They completely collapsed in China because the Chinese are not buying European cars. They are still holding up in Europe because the Europeans are still buying fuel-driven cars. But on electric cars, the Europeans are not doing well. And the reason is the Chinese are not only cheaper, but more importantly, they're technologically advanced. This is both true for batteries, over which China has an unbeatable supply chain advantage. But I think in the long run, the more serious gap is in software and AI. The big prize in the car business will go to car companies that will produce self-driving cars. As I'm getting older, I'm not a great driver. I drive, but as I'm getting older, maybe in 15, 20 years' time, I will no longer want to drive. I will buy the car that drives me. I don't think the Germans are basically on a trajectory for. They haven't even tested. The Chinese, if you look at Tesla, is ahead of the Europeans massively in terms of the number of data points they collected in self-driving tests. But even Tesla is hopelessly behind the market leaders in China and Waymo, which is the big company in the United States that does that. Now, this is this is what the AI Act did, and it's not just the act itself, but our attitudes that gave rise to the AI. Whenever an electric car has an accident, the newspapers report it, like, oh, someone died in an accident, and how bad the electric cars are. But they don't report the 2,000 or so road deaths caused by the other cars. There's a sort of a social attitude in Europe that has kind of conspired against this, and politics and business all together in this and late recognition. Now, I think it's quite possible that this is an industry we're losing, like typewriters. The typewriter industry was very confident. I write this in my book, that the US typewriter industry, when the computer was invented, the US typewriter industry for about 10 years was very confident that they could actually keep up with it, and they actually integrated computer technology into the typewriters. If you're old enough, you will know these typewriters with little windows in them, and there were little computers in them. And it was because at the time computers didn't come with good printers. That didn't happen until the 1990s, until the printers started producing quality output. And that was before into the internet when we started to get electronic in any case. And that's pretty much the same. The Germans integrated, and they always prided themselves of integrating digital technologies into their analog devices. But the electric car is a digital device. We have to think on the electric car is like an iPad, more like an iPad than a car. It has. That's why you have sort of companies like Xiaomi, the mobile phone manufacturer. They're sort of they've just produced a car that beat Porsche on the Nürburgring in Germany. It's unbelievable. A newcomer with no experience in the car industry, producing their first electric car and beating sort of the world champion of race cars, and that's basically showing what we're up against. And I think we will still make cars, but we will not make a lot of money with it as we did in the past. So I think the Europeans better think of something else or think of new industries and think about diversification and about innovation. But But I think the focus on cars that we've had in Europe for so long, cars, chemicals, steel, it's always the same. Whenever we talk about industry, we're always talking about like 4 or 5 industries. I think this is too narrow.
Mr. nchau, thank you for your presentation. It was a bit depressing for us Europeans, but I think very realistic. And what I would like to ask you was also in a focus on the energy transition, and also Europe trying to be the champion of the energy transition, even though that brings added costs to its industries, it compromises its competitiveness in the future and maybe ultimately its viability. What do you think will happen with the energy transition globally and with Europe's role in it in the future? Thank you.
I think the energy transition was right. It's just the way Europe did it was wrong. I don't think Europe was completely wrong here. The mistake was made in countries like Germany, where they shut off the nuclear power, where they gave very binding timescales for the coal. And I supported this, but I didn't support the nuclear thing. I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, that would have been a good moment politically to say, look, something has changed. We have to kind of think about what it means rather than stick to timetables. I think this is where the political mistake happened. China is investing in renewable energies like nobody is investing it. So it's the right thing to do. And I think the idea that we have to go back to oil and gas is not right. But to introduce more flexibility, to do it more strategically, and to base this less on binding timetables. I think I think it was a German thing that they wanted to have dates, binding dates. We need to be there by 2035. We have to have these CO2 targets by that. That is where things went wrong. And the attempt to meet those deadlines led to very bad decisions, political decisions on the way. It was not a strategic thing. But still think the strategic direction of having a renewable strategy is broadly right. I mean, France is lucky. They have had consensus behind nuclear energy for a long time. It works. It produces cheap energy. Fine. I mean, the only cheap energy Germany ever had were domestic coal and Russian gas, and both are gone. So if you're in this situation, I think the Iberian Peninsula is lucky. It has, as you see outside, a lot of sunshine, and solar panels will over the long run produce energy. You're also close to North Africa, that could produce very significant amounts of low-cost energy and transmit it. I don't think it can be transmitted to Northern Europe, but it can be transmitted to Southern Europe. So there are sort of some natural advantages for the Iberian Peninsula in terms of renewable energy. I still think this is the right way to go in the long run. One has to be sensible in the way one introduces this. So in my list of criticism of what Europe did, I think what it did to technology is really catastrophic. The energy thing, I'm more the disappointment. I can kind of see the point for this. What I just, the problem they did in energy and in all the environmental tech is they didn't enough focus on innovation. And that's sort of an underlying thread. It's a lot of the successes in energy in the future are likely to come from technologies that have probably not been yet invented. The EU has not done enough to focus on innovation. And again, this requires a more vibrant capital market. This is not something we can do through EU programs.
stopped integrating at the euro. And some of the solutions or aspects that you exposed here could be easily or more easily achievable through a bigger European integration. Yeah. But at the same time, you just spoke also of different treatment to different countries inside the European Union regarding an economical crisis like the one we are about to have in France. That sort of disparity of criteria only gives power to extremist movements, as we are seeing all over Europe. So how can we really believe in a more integrated European future where Europe itself, it's not aligned politically, economically, financially with such an integrated future? How can we believe in that and have hope of not having the period that you said of we will have a bad time for like 5 years and then maybe we will pick up the pieces later? Is this avoidable? Is this believable and avoidable that we can be in a union, a literal union, a single market of 500 million people, and not a big collage of mini markets, because that's what we really are right now. So is it believable that we can make that transition given the context that we have right now, or is it impossible?
No, I wouldn't say it's not impossible. If you know, my generation is not going to do it for you. I can absolutely guarantee that. So it's really much up to your generation. The generation when I grew up, the generation of the people who were older, they were the generation that built Europe. You know, my generation was the one that exploited Europe to its benefits. It was all about what Europe can do for us, not what we can do for Europe. And that was, you know, the famous John F. Kennedy line. And that was different with the generation of, you know, the generation of de Gaulle, Adenauer, Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, François Mitterrand, of that era. That was an era of people who contributed. And the answer to your question will be, it's your generation that will ultimately have to make these political decisions of what it prioritizes and whether it wants to return to this or whether it has other priorities. At the moment, I don't see it, to be frank. I don't see I think the politics of the young was, like 10 years ago, pro-green. I see the politics of the young going to the left and the right. Certainly in Germany, we see the young being the strongest supporters of the right today are the young people. Also the left, the extreme left. So the young people sort of splintering into these extremes, and both are anti-European. So the question is whether a new pro-European force can be created. I don't think it can happen through the existing parties, so it's quite an obstacle. So it needs to be something like what Macron did, a kind of a political movement that's outside the mainstream, but it's centrist, with a new narrative, but not like Macron. You don't want to end it like Macron. So you want to have it, you know, you want to have an intelligent version of this. But I think it started off quite well, I have to say. You know, I think the first term wasn't too bad, or the first year or two were actually quite good, and things descended there. But I think that's what it will take. But it will require political renewal of a way that we have not experienced in a very long time.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was, let's say, kind of a bleak future, but probably that's the truth. My question is, how do you see the trend in demography in Europe? Or clearly there is a decrease in the population, and how this will add to the difficulties that you have clearly presented. And I don't want, let's say, to start discussing on the migration and this and that. That's part of the problem or part of the question. But clearly, when you state that we have to invest in the innovation, to have to think differently, but we have a practical and actual question is that we don't have people to do that, and I will see that as a problem, how this could be coped in the near future. Thank you.
I mean, demography, low growth is obviously as economists say, endogenous. It's sort of something that, people have less hope in the future, they have fewer children. That itself reduces growth, so you're getting to vicious circles. And you see the countries, Italy was probably the first European country which stopped having productivity growth right after it joined the euro. So Italy was sort of in 2000, it was the country that went, and we all thought Italy was the exception. But Italy was like just ahead of us. Everybody has now followed Italy. It's not Italy followed the rest, but everybody's like Italy. And even France, which had a very strong, it was close to replacement birth rates until not too long ago, is now descending in its birth rate. So everybody's following the same pattern: low growth, low productivity growth, and demographic decline. A further complicating factor will be AI, because I'm not sure whether the AI is a bubble, when it will burst. I have no idea. But what I'm absolutely convinced is that AI as an industry is not a bubble. Now, we had a dot-com bubble in 2000, but dot-com itself was not a bubble. Dot-com itself was the life-changing technology that dominated our lives. And AI will be very similar. And that's a further complication because it may need that, it could well be, let me make an optimistic case, that we can actually prosper with fewer people as AI takes up some of the jobs. Because one of the problems with demographic decline is that companies don't get the workforce they need. That would have been the problem in previous generations. AI will have a massive impact on productivity in companies. And when companies have higher productivity, that means they do the same amount of work with fewer people. That's what productivity increases mean. And if you have fewer people, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, in the long run, you don't want to have declining populations. But the idea that a declining population has to mean, bad economic outcomes, is not a given. So I would not say that, or the fact that a declining population requires that you have to have immigration to make up for this. I don't think this is a given. And I think technology can play in your favor here. So I'm on this front, I'm not as pessimistic as others are, who just think of demography as the most important thing. I don't think it is. And here, another sort of thing, also for entrepreneurs, the biggest benefit of AI will not go to NVIDIA or Google. The biggest benefit of AI will go to those who use it and to the countries that use it. That's where the massive economic benefit comes on. This will outshine all the share price effects that you have from the AI industry. So if a normal company uses AI to its advantage, it could raise a lot of profits by doing so. And that's I think the big payoff. And if you talk about upside scenarios, you want to have something, AI, crypto currencies, quantum computing. These are technological revolutions and all the stuff that's happening in medicine. These are technological revolutions with a very potentially far-reaching impact, also an impact on growth. So we might get lucky.
Last question? Do you have any more questions? No questions, so we finish.
Okay, thank you.
So much.